All right.
Wow, it announces it. Did you hear that?
Yeah, it's nice for that. So, all right, we'll keep admitting as people come in, and just want to say welcome for tonight. So I'm going to let Brandon go ahead and give a brief overview of what Theology Uncorked is, and I'll keep admitting people into the room.
Yeah, so appreciate everyone coming. So for those who are new today, Theology Uncorked is something that we started about 6 years ago when Tirza and I moved here to Cross Point. The whole thought of what Theology Uncorked was stemmed from my graduate school days at Catholic University, where once a quarter, our professors would take off their collars and then would dress up in sweatshirts and show up at a local restaurant, and we would just debate topics. And it was a really symbolic thing that I always appreciated, where in the classroom, it was really clear who the leader was and who the students were, because they were standing and we were sitting. But once every 3 or 4 months, we were all friends having a conversation. So we started doing something similar to that when we moved here. We're about 6 years in. We have a nice core group of folks that come. We have talked about every topic under the sun, and I'll let Tirza introduce today's topic, but we've had a lot of fun. This is something we do the last Tuesday of every month. Hot weather, cold weather, fall weather, weird weather. We meet. Since COVID, we've been doing it online, which has allowed us to bring some guest speakers in. And so appreciate everyone today who are coming as a guest. And yeah, if there's anything we can do, you can get in touch with Tirza, and we'd be happy to have you to do that. So anyway, thanks for coming. I really appreciate it.
All right, so thanks again. Hi to everybody that I haven't gotten a chance to say hi to yet. We're talking tonight about Leandro. So the question I've gotten from free people is, why would we talk about this? What's this topic? And we've talked about a ton of different things as far, like Brandon said. And just one of the reasons we want to talk about this tonight is because it's important. Because it touches so many people in our state, especially the most vulnerable among us. It addresses public education. And as people of faith, we believe that that's who we're supposed to be taking care of and ministering to and paying attention to and putting our energy into. So this is a big topic right now. And in my circles, we've talked about it quite a bit as far as North Carolina Council of Churches and with PTA. And so that's why this was on my recent radar. And I got the privilege through that to be able to meet two really great people. And I'm going to introduce both of them, and then I'm going to turn it over to them to share this evening. So our first presenter, well, Suzanne is going to present first, so then we're going to kind of go back and forth a little bit, sharing bits and pieces of what their organizations do and how it relates to Leandro. So Reverend Suzanne Parker Miller, you can wave at us, Suzanne, so we know who you are. She is the executive director of Pastors for North Carolina Children, or Pastors for NC Children. And she has degrees from Meredith College and Moravian Theological Seminary. She's a local too. She's from Winston-Salem, is that right? Yep, I got that right. She has a certificate in justice ministry education through Auburn Seminary. She's a Moravian minister. She serves at our children's Wake County PTA Public School as the PTA Vice President of Advocacy. She has coordinated Take Our Elected Official to School Day for several years. And she also founded North Carolina Families for School Testing Reform in 2018. And she serves now as an advisor. And the mission of Pastors for North Carolina Children is to mobilize faith leaders to advocate for justice in our public schools in North Carolina. So Suzanne is going to present first, and then we're going to hear from Miss Brenda Berg, Brenda, you want to wave at us so we know who you are? She is the president and CEO of BEST NC, and BEST stands for Businesses for Education Success and Transformation North Carolina. Did I get that right, Brenda? Okay, perfect. She has over 25 years of experience as a business owner, a public policy professional, and an education advocate. And in 2002, she founded Scandinavian Child, which is a baby products manufacturing and importing business. And prior to founding her business, she had almost 10 years of public policy experience in education and transportation policy and programs. And currently, she serves on various boards and educational organizations. And BEST NC is a nonprofit, nonpartisan coalition of business leaders committed to improving North Carolina's education system through policy and advocacy. So I'm glad that's all recorded, so I don't have to repeat it. But basically, these ladies are doing great work along with a lot of other people in our state right now. So I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne, so you can explain what Leandro is, and we're going to listen to you for a bit. Sorry, right before you do that, if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat. We'll monitor the chat and then have an official kind of Q&A at the end. And if something comes up in between that we need to address, we'll go ahead and do that. All right,
okay.
Suzanne.
Can you all see my screen? It says Pastors for NC Children. Okay, good. You'll have to shout if you don't see something or if you can't hear me. Well, I'm so excited to be here tonight. I appreciate the invitation. And, this is just a great opportunity for us to continue to share who we are as Pastors for North Carolina Children and the work that we're doing around Leandro. Pastors for NC Children is a founding member of the Every Child in C Coalition, which is a coalition, the Communities for the Education of Every Child in C. And we are a group of over 40 advocacy, parent, teacher, student organizations around the state who are working to push the Leandro plan to make it happen as it is. And I will be going into that in a minute, but I wanted to give you just a brief little look at who we are. This is my little agenda tonight. So we're going to be going through a couple of different things around the basics of North Carolina, what education looks like in North Carolina as far as just some basic facts and figures. But I'd love, as we're starting, and I will be sharing my PowerPoint with you all as well. So I know there's a lot of text at times. Don't worry about reading it. Don't worry about taking notes. Just listen and pop your questions in the chat, and then I'll be glad to share this as soon as we're done. So I'd like to see in the chat, if you could just post a number 1 through 5 here. Have you heard of the Leandro case or the Leandro plan? 1 being, I have not heard of it at all, that this is the first time it's come up in your spheres. Or 5, you could teach others about Leandro and do a presentation on it. So I'd love to see 1 through 5 where folks are, if you're willing to just post a number in the chat. I'll say most of the groups I'm presenting to, most congregations are in the 1 and 2 category. So this is kind of where I'm starting, with maybe you've heard about it on the news. It's a big deal in North Carolina. And so we want to be sure folks know what's happening. Pastors for Children as an organization, we started in Texas in 2013. We've expanded into 8 states. And so we were the 7th state to launch in the network. They're all ecumenical groups working across lots of denominational lines, lots of, big city churches and small town churches, trying to bring everybody together to support public education. So that's just a brief history of who we are, all covering the Southeast at the moment. As far as our organization, we launched in June 2020. I've been working on it for 2 years, over 2 years at this point, but we officially launched last June. We've received our 501c3, and our main focuses are, like I said here, the Leandro plan. We're also against voucher expansion. We don't believe that public money should go to private schools. We believe that keeping that public money is an important part of the public good and building the beloved community, which I'll talk about a little bit more. I've got some links here that you can click on those later and sign up for our newsletter and stuff. So a brief history of, or overview of what North Carolina schools look like. North Carolina has 115 LEAs, local education agencies, which are the districts. 89 of those are county-wide districts within the state. 11 counties have multiple, where there's like a county and a city district. Those are the ones circled in red here, but by far the majority of our counties are like Wake, where they have the 1 district now. As far as the schools in our state, 2,400 schools in our state are traditional schools. And what we mean by traditional are schools that are part of those 115 LEAs that are have elected school boards and are governed by our democratic system, where you elect the people, and those are the people accountable for the schools. We also have 196 charter schools, other schools here, for a total of 3,400 schools across the state. But you can see by far the majority of our schools are the traditional schools. the state has about 1.5 million school children, and 80% of those children attend one of these traditional schools. We also have almost 9,400 teachers and support staff. One of the things that I think is really interesting is when you look at the state within the 115 districts, public schools were the top employer in 55 counties. They're one of the top 3 employers in 94 out of 100. And they're one of the top 5 in all 100. So public schools not only affect our 1.5 million children, they're affecting our entire communities. The people that are sitting in our pews in our churches, the people who are living down the street from us, they affect everyone. The state education budget is right around $9.4 billion, and it is 39.5% of the state budget. So it is our single largest expenditure as a state from our state budget. So, it is something that we all should be paying attention to. So why is work needed on our public schools? Why do we need to be talking about this? Well, a couple of things to consider here. One is that this $9.4 billion that I mentioned from our 2018-19 budget, it is more, every year they have increased the funding, except for here where the recession hit, or the big recession we had in 2008. They are putting more money into the schools. Those talking points are correct on the political ads. They've always, they're spending more than they ever have on schools. The problem is that when we look at the percentages and the growth that the school system has experienced since the early 2000s, since our state has experienced, we're actually at a 6% decrease of where we would have been in just the 2008-2009 numbers. So here, right here in these 8, these where the dip is, we're actually at a 6% decrease. So funding has just not kept up with the growth of our state. Another interesting fact here, in 1970, the percent of our funds for the state, the education in our state took up 52.5% of our state budget. It was over half of our state budget. During the financial crisis, it was 37% of the state budget here in 2008, 2009, and now it's only 39.5%. So you can see how the funding has just continued to decrease over the years. And yes, it's risen a little bit here, but it's still nowhere near what it used to be. And so our public schools are starved. They're absolutely starved of the resources and the teachers and the positions that they need. Now, even prior to 2008, 2009, when the Great Recession hit, we weren't doing well. North Carolina does not have a great track record as far as funding and support of our public schools. In these early years before the Great Recession, we were 43rd in per student funding. We were 42nd in effort, which effort is the amount of money our state puts into education as a percentage of our gross domestic product as a state, our GDP. So this is 42nd. We're currently 50th, I believe. So we've actually dropped, which is definitely not a good thing. We're last in the amount of money we could put into the state that we are into education that we're not as a state. Education Week gave us an F. So this is not, looking back at the early 2000 numbers are not exactly somewhere that's, that where things were good. So what does this mean in a little bit more practical terms? It means that if you're in the schools today, you're seeing less instructional support people. You're seeing less nurses, psychologists, counselors, the instructional coaches who are the ones who are working with students and doing that one-on-one tutoring or that support for the teachers and the students who might be lagging behind. I know at my children's school here in Wake County, they're at a magnet school downtown, and you can only get sick on Wednesdays because that's the only day that the nurse is available. Don't get sick another day because then the secretary has to deal with it. And that's frankly not her job. And that's not what she's trained to do. She's great, but it's not her job. So we don't have full-time nurses in our schools in most places. We also have, 7.6 fewer principals and assistant principals. They're the leaders of our school. And when we're lacking people, it creates real problems. This one, especially, I don't know if you all were living here and remember when the teacher assistant positions were cut, but we're 34% less teaching assistant positions. And those are the teachers, especially in those K through third grade grades, who are the reading group leaders. They do a lot of the small group instruction around reading and math and helping our students to be able to have that differentiated instruction. And so those positions are extremely important, especially when we consider third grade reading scores, you know, in our state are not great, not where they need to be. All of these different things, 50% less in textbooks. You know, if you're like me, your children don't have textbooks that they're bringing home. They don't exist at this point. You know, the materials and supply money is just about gone. 56% less than it was. I know our last PTA meeting at my children's school, we spent probably 30 minutes or more brainstorming around our principal having to cut funding for paper in the workrooms and how she was trying to make up over a $1,200 deficit in the school budget this year because attendance wasn't what they were projecting, and how they're going to make up, you know, make up for lost paper when they don't have textbooks, so they need to make copies. You know, all of these things are just really showing how our schools are starved. Also in our state, as we've seen in the last few years, educators are certainly not feeling valued, and they aren't when we look at the data. You know, we've eliminated the school national board application costs. They've taken away that payment. They've eliminated the teaching fellows. They put the program back now, but it's a shell of what it once was. It's certainly not the premier program like it was, I know, when I was in school. Teacher evaluations are based on EVOS, which is a really horrible system I can go into later if you have questions. The elimination of career status and master's supplements, we've just taken away from the teachers. And so we know that, you know, we have a teacher crisis. I know that's something Brenda will probably be referencing, and something that they're really working on is our lack of teachers, the lack of teacher pipeline, the lack of principals, the lack of principal pipeline, having a well-trained teacher and a well-trained principal in every school. Who wants to come work for our state when all of these things have been taken away, plus all of the funding has been taken away in so many different places? And we know, as we focus on children, students' learning conditions are teachers' teaching conditions, their working conditions. So it's not good for anybody in those situations. Now, why all of this really matters, or one of the reasons it matters so much, is in North Carolina, unlike most other states, or many states, the local funding, the local taxes are what controls the majority of the school funding. And that is not the case in North Carolina. In North Carolina, the state makes up the far majority, 63%, of the funding for schools. It covers everything from salaries and materials, everything that they need physically and people-wise to educate our children. Federal money that comes in, the 10% or so, includes the IDEA, which is Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and things like the school breakfast and lunch program, and the CTE, the Career and Technical Education. All of those are federal programs. Local things are covering the supplements. So Wake County gives a supplement to their teachers to help cover the cost of living differences that the state doesn't make up. And those local supplements have continued to increase as local districts try to make up the difference for the lack of funding from the state. And it's just continued to put further strain on our local funding. Local schools are also providing the buildings and the infrastructure. So things like buses and, you know, the HVAC systems and those types of things are maintained by the K-12, or by the local funding for K-12. And when we talk about buildings, we have to recognize that our state is having a real crisis of infrastructure, not only in buildings, but especially in our school buildings. As of September 1st, the newest numbers came out for school infrastructure, and we are at $12.8 billion of reported need over the next 5 years to improve, build, or repair facilities in our state. It has increased $5 billion in the last 6 years. And, you know, a lot of times I get questions about the lottery. The lottery is giving us 838 million. Most of that, that's what the state provides. Most of that's coming from the lottery. Also, another thing I can discuss later, the lottery is a joke. It's not additional money. It's just replacing it and switching buckets around. So, you know, we just haven't had the funding, and the state, the local districts are not able to provide the funding a lot of times because they're trying to make up the differences in salary and supplies that the schools need. And so that's happened at the neglect of our buildings. So the second reason that our work is needed and that we need your help is that the case with Leandro. So that I gave you the idea of where things have stood in our state, but I want to talk specifically about the Leandro case. So this is what we need people to really understand so that you can help us provide the political will necessary to get the General Assembly to comply with the Leandro plan from the courts. In 1994, these 5 counties highlighted in red, Vance, Halifax, Cumberland, Hoke, and Robeson counties, got together, and the families in those counties, 5 families, sued the state of North Carolina because the state was not abiding by its constitutional obligation to provide children with a sound basic education. These 5 class action suits eventually were joined in with other counties and other areas, and it's become a statewide case. It is still in the courts. It's now been in the courts for over 27 years, and it's still being argued and being dealt with. We had the latest hearing last Monday, the 18th, trying to get resolution to this case. It was ruled in 1997 that the state is responsible. They've ruled again. There was a Leandro 2 where they said that yes, the state is responsible. Both parties, judges, both sides, you know, have gotten to the point where they all agree. The plaintiffs and the defendants, the governor, the folks, all that are involved in the case have gotten together and said, okay, we're going to stop fighting the case. We all agree that yes, children need a sound basic education. And so what they have done is in 2018, Judge Lee, who's the current judge working on the case, he appointed WestEd, which is an independent company. They do public education work, and they did a study to figure out what it means to provide the sound basic education. What does that look like? They did studies around the state and came back with a roadmap and suggestions. There's 8 recommendations that were brought from WestEd and adopted by the courts. It was issued in 2019. And just as a note, our Every Child in C coalition that we're part of began forming in 2019 because we know we need to hold the legislature accountable to enact the Leandro plan as it's been adopted by the courts. So the 8 recommendations, I'm not going to read through all of this, but basically we need qualified teachers, we need qualified principals, we need to make sure that the kids who are most vulnerable are receiving the extra resources and support that they need to catch them up. We know that we need to revise the accountability system because there's definitely inequity in that. A lot of the test scores and the test rating systems measure wealth of the family and wealth and education of the parents of the students and where the children live much more than they actually study or show us the students' abilities. We also need to just continue to work on the funding and the ways that that's more equitably distributed. Take a break there. Excuse me. So the focus and one of the things that I love most about Leandro, especially from the faith perspective for me, is that the Leandro case really focuses on the 6 most vulnerable groups of students in our state. The students that are considered most vulnerable or most marginalized by our current inequities are the students in pre-K who are not yet receiving an adequate pre-K education, because we know that that contributes significantly to greater success later on if they're coming into school prepared. We also know that students are receiving less attention who are racially discriminated against, those Black, Hispanic, Latino, and Indigenous students who are, just by the melanin in their skin, not receiving an adequate education. We also know students with special needs, with physical, emotional, or learning differences, are just not getting the educations that they need. The funding is not there to be able to adequately meet their needs. There's caps on that are not helpful. We also know students who are coming from low wealth families are not receiving what they need. And also those who are living in the rural areas. That was the original intent of the Leandro case, was dealing with the rural areas of our state, but they're certainly only one of the groups. And then those who are learning English are students who are coming into school, maybe speaking a different language at home, or learning English as they arrive in school. So with the Leandro case, our Every Child NC partners have put together a really helpful estimated impact analysis to help us know how much money Leandro would provide for the different districts around the state. I pulled up the Wake County numbers, and by the time the 8-year plan is now a 7-year plan for 2028, by the time it would be fully enacted, Wake County would be receiving 30% more funding than it currently is. That would provide, especially for things like our disadvantaged student groups, our instructional support system, and those positions. You can look at the numbers more closely, and I have the link to it on here. You can go in and pull up any county, any district in the state to be able to see the impact. And Wake County is one of the wealthiest districts in the state. We are seeing much less impact from the lack of funding in Wake County than most of the counties in the state are. And so this would benefit every child, every citizen in the state, but we would be receiving less, of course, than some of the districts who just don't have the tax base that we have here. I'm almost done with this section, but like I said, this instructional support positions, the IAs, the teachers assistants, it would provide for 885 additional positions. And those were the ones that are cut, basically replacing the ones that very similarly were cut a few years back, because we know that they lead to success. That's one of the things that we know really provides success for children. So last part, real briefly, from the faith perspective, looking at the faith and moral obligations that we have. We know that charity is important, and churches do charity really, really well. Most churches are very giving and want to help. And so we see a lot of churches doing, and you guys probably have done similar, like book drives or book bags or food for kids or supply drives. Those are really great things to do. The problem is when we're not addressing the systems that are causing the inequities underneath, then we have an incomplete system. And so we really have to work on the systems, the justice work as well. These are two of my favorite quotes. Justice, what is justice? It's what love looks like in public. And also Jim Wallace's quote about, if the gospel is not good news to the poor, then it's not good news. So, really focusing on that. And then this, for me, it all comes down to creating the beloved community. We want to create the world that we want to live in. We want to create the world that God calls us to in the Lord's Prayer and many, many places in Scripture where we're called to create a better world and a more just society. And this creation of the beloved community that Martin Luther King talked about, I think, is just so important as we look at, why education matters, why this really, caring for our children in our state, especially the most marginalized and most vulnerable, is really caring for our neighbors. And that's what Christ called us to do. I have whole presentations about the scripture behind all of this and so on, which we can do another time if you're interested. But, the beloved community is where justice and equity reign, where people have the health and security and the safety that they need to be thriving, flourishing citizens. and where they have the education. And that to me is what it really comes down to, is we know that this is how we lift children out of poverty. We know that this is how we make our communities better and safer and, you know, healthier. And so education is such an important part of all of those things. And it's really valuable. So I really believe that building the beloved community through education is really key. So I think that's all I have for now. So I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much.
I realize that was a lot, but
no, it's great. You know what? I would love if anybody has a quick question or anything that we need. Do we have anything in the chat, Brandon, that we need to address?
Sarah has said a couple of things about people who are in or working in public schools in North Carolina see a lot of what you shared, Suzanne. And then you got a big thank you for some of the connection points to some of the faith aspects of this. So appreciate that.
All right, Brenda, I would love to turn it over to you and hear a little bit more about what you do.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation to be here tonight. This is such an incredibly important conversation. And Suzanne, well done. And Brandon, I want to thank you for bringing us to your experience at Catholic University. I went to a Jesuit school, and I'm a first-generation college goer. It was a formative experience, and I'm with my son now looking at colleges. I'm thinking about that important experience of civil discourse that we learned at my college and through graduate school. And so thank you for bringing us to that point. I think it's incredibly important. And nothing for me more important than education. Again, this has been my mission since really even since college. I worked on Capitol Hill and on education issues. So just a quick thing about Best NC, you heard the introduction. Yay, Fairfield and Georgetown. I'm a double Hoya. So, hey, that's great. Best NC, as you heard, business organization supporting public education. Here's our mission: to unite an engaged and informed, and I really want to kind of underscore informed business perspective to build consensus towards dramatically transforming and improving education in North Carolina. So excellent. I'm really proud of this work. The business community pulled this organization together in 2013. We launched in 2014, and we launched what we call Educator Innovation, which is sort of the crux of what I'm going to talk about tonight, at the beginning of 2015. So if you look at that timeline that Suzanne went through, it sort of post dates the beginning of the Leandro case, although I spent a tremendous amount of time with Judge Manning when we first launched Best NC, kind of to get it right on the Leandro pieces. And of course we predate this new kind of phase with West Ed and the reports. So since the beginning, Best NC has had these three imperatives on our website. We believe that we have an economic, constitutional, and moral imperative for education in North Carolina. It's absolutely a core of what we believe. And as I said, we launched in 2014 and 2015. We launched our strategy, and our strategy was to primarily, I'd say 80% of our work focuses on the people in education. You don't want the business community to come in and start talking about curriculum, but what we can do is talk about how do we, in our most successful minutes of our world as business people, do our very best to recruit and prepare and support and develop our talent, our people. And that in K-12 is the most important thing that we can do. Give me a great teacher and a great principal and a chalkboard over a bunch of fancy technology any day. So let's focus on our people, and that's been the thrust of our work. Suzanne brought you through a bunch of very depressing data, and I will as well, unfortunately, but I'm gonna start with something that shows the optimism that I have for North Carolina. I am not native to North Carolina. I was born in Minnesota. I've been here for 21 years. Both my kids were born here. But the thing that I realized when I got here was this incredible commitment to education and frankly, just to innovation in North Carolina. RTP is a great example of how the state said, we need to do something about our industry in North Carolina. We're going to create this hub and we're going to really modernize our state and move it forward. And they did it in a big way. Fun fact, 1972, I think, we were the first state in the nation to have universal all-day kindergarten. That's amazing. There are something like 18 states that still don't have universal all-day kindergarten. And Suzanne pointed out that pie chart of funding. That didn't happen by accident. In 1931, we had what's called the Machinery Act. The schools were shutting down because of the Depression. Schools all over the South were shutting down. And kind of similar to where we are now, the state hired the Brookings Institute. They put together what's called the Brookings Plan and implemented this plan to move operational funding to the state level. So that didn't happen by accident. All across the country, starting late, like in the 70s, other states started to realize that this property tax-based funding wasn't not equitable, and frankly, it wasn't even equal. And yet North Carolina had already been tackling this issue since 1931, which I think is pretty amazing. And I'll also put out there, 1931 is also a good example of how we can innovate, but it's also an example of how we can get things wrong in the long term. There can be unintended consequences. We are always going to, and making the sausage, not get everything right. But again, Suzanne pointed out the construction issues that we have. That was the bargain in 1931. We'll take care of operations at the state level. Districts will be responsible for their facilities. That was the grand bargain. And here we are sitting here in $12 billion of infrastructure needs. So nothing will be perfect. But the point is to let's make bold, brave efforts forward. And they have to be systemic changes, right? Because we're not going to make, it's what is the definition of insanity, to keep doing the same thing, expecting a different result. So, but I will show you what I believe all of those very important rocks along the way have given to us. I know you saw a lot of like, we're X% in the state or whatnot, but here's one thing I do want to show you. When I looked at our NAEP scores, which are our national assessment comparisons to other states, when you look at North Carolina, it's kind of sad, right? When you're looking at about a third of our 8th graders can read on grade level. It's really important that we get all of our students reading on grade level. But as you can see, the national average is 32% in that same lane, and Massachusetts, which is #1 in the nation, is at 45%. So even if we're #1 in the nation, we're not where we need to be. I will point out something else though. Even when our funding has typically been in the bottom quintile, even maybe the bottom quartile, our rankings have always been about average, maybe a little bit above average. Again, I will point out that we are in a below average country, so this is not good enough, right? But I will point out the Urban Institute does a comparison. If you compare our students to like students in other states and the demographics of our state, we have a lot to be proud of. And I just want to ground us in that just for a moment, because I'm about to get some really devastating statistics to show up here. We are actually 6th and 4th grade reading, 7th and 4th grade math, 11th and 8th grade reading, and 3rd and 8th grade math. This is really important. Like, we should really remember that when you look at our investment, that we've decided that state funding and our funding, we can have lots of conversation about adequacy. I don't believe we have adequate funding, but we have more equitable funding than almost any other state in the country. We fund our poor schools more than our wealthy schools significantly. We fund our rural schools more than our urban schools. We fund our majority Black schools more than our majority white schools. That is kind of unheard of in the country. So I do want to just take a moment to say big, bold things can have big, bold results. So now I'm going to get to the bad stuff. So I'm going to whip through, these are COVID numbers. So the numbers you're seeing here are pre-COVID. What we found in the COVID results is that last year, math and reading proficiency fell below 50% in every single category from grades 3 to 8. Nearly every subgroup declined in critical gateways of 3rd grade reading and 8th grade math. I say nearly only because gifted students in reading stayed the same at 95%. Everybody else dropped. And proficiency gaps have widened. So that is poor, not poor, Black, white gaps, achievement gaps have widened. I'm not going to dwell on these data points. I'm happy to share this afterward, but here are the below 50% on all of these orange bars across the entire landscape. Blue is where we were pre-COVID. And here are those declines by subgroup in reading and in math. Can I point out, and this is something we started talking about at the beginning of the COVID crisis, was the homeless students that were being excluded from learning, 70% decline. Now, granted, please take these with a grain of salt because there are certain participation issues. Some clusters of students and some clusters of districts chose not to participate in taking these exams, but overall the state had about a 95% participation rate. And this is enough to sort of give us a sense of where we're sitting with student learning. I can't, right? And then last, but certainly not least, these achievement gaps. I'm just looking here at poverty level. The gap widened for third grade proficiency from a 38% gap to a 48% gap, and career and college readiness from a 48% gap to a 60% gap. And the numbers are fairly similar when you look at black and white. Sorry, bad news, but it only powers us more. These are the data that compelled our work pre-COVID. We really believe in systemic change. And one thing we did when we started doing our work is we started looking at outliers. We started looking at the schools that are doing great things in Wake County and statewide. And the best schools do really 5 things consistently across all the schools, but the 2 that are the most important is that they invest in good people, principals and teachers and support staff, period, full stop, right? And that was what grounded our work in 2015. So our theory of action, I won't bore you with this, but if you go to our website, we have a Sound Basic Education landing page, and there's a video about our understanding of sort of why we have a systemic problem with how we recruit, prepare, and support our teachers and principals. Fundamentally, it's not professional. We're not treating our people as professionals. So if you have a minute, I'll drop the link and share it with you, but this is a 7-minute video that can kind of give you a sense of where our starting point was with our work. So I talked about educator innovation. It's grounded in 3 core ideas: school leadership, access to educators, so not just the quantity of educators, but making sure that we get every student has access to great educators, and then the educator experience itself, having educators have a great experience. And I'm going to go through 3 components of this, all of which are included in the Leandro plan and sort of lifted up in the Leandro plan. One is called advanced teaching roles. And this is really stems from the recognition that the average, some fundamental problems within a school building that most of us don't see when we walk into the school building, particularly, business leaders. We walk in and we look at the school, we just assume it's kind of running like our organizations. But the average principal has 50 direct reports. That just doesn't work. The average in the business world is 6 to 8, and in the military, it's as low as 4, right? So we've had this fundamental struggle where you have a principal with all these direct reports, and you have beginning teachers coming in and they're going to their instructional leader, and he has 49 other direct reports. And then we have these great, incredible teachers who are leaving the profession, maybe to become a principal, maybe to go to central office, because they're not feeling like they have a pathway within their school building, and where we could be rewarding them. And advanced teaching roles will give master teachers an opportunity to earn as much as $20,000 more for a leadership role as a teacher, staying in the classroom, working with those developing teachers, and not having to go and become an administrator. And this is working in these counties that you see highlighted here. Over half of Charlotte-Mecklenburg's schools are now doing this. It's a tricky transition, but it can be done, and they've actually done it within budget. We're certainly advocating for additional funds to be able to do it with additional funding. But it's pretty extraordinary. Also, if you have extraordinary teachers who just don't want to be leaders of other teachers, of other adults, that certainly happens. This advanced teaching roles offers an opportunity that if you just want to take on more students or a harder classroom, you can get paid more to do it, which is kind of a duh. But I walked into a classroom here in Wake County, and the principal was like, "Isn't that great? She's my best teacher." I'm like, "Why are there 15 kids in that classroom?" The average, it should be 25. It was a middle school. And I was like, "Well, that's what I give her. I give her an easier classroom because she's great." I'm like, "No." So anyway, so advanced teaching roles is one way that we're working on this. I'm just pausing to see if we have any. Wow, there's a lot of comments, but I will get to those. I just want to see if there are any questions about advanced teaching roles specifically. Or should we wait? Okay, we'll wait. So the next thing I just want to touch on kind of quickly is our organization raised the funds to launch a teacher recruitment initiative. I'm super excited about this. We just finished up the second year of this initiative. We've identified almost 13,000 people who want to be teachers. This is not trying to convince people to be teachers. These are people who want to be teachers. And typically they fall into two overlapping buckets. They need information that they're not able to get otherwise, and they need support. More often than not, these candidates are candidates of color. They're candidates who are male candidates. They're sort of non-traditional candidates, and they haven't seen educators who look like them. So we have created a whole core of ambassadors who can answer questions about what it's like to be a teacher and how do you get into the profession and how does it feel to be a male teacher in a school of mostly female teachers, that kind of conversation that doesn't usually happen. Those advising teachers, they had 900 advising calls this year with candidates and 600 the year before, which interestingly enough tracks nicely to about the number of people who are then saying that they're actually enrolling in an ed prep program or actually entering the classroom as a resident teacher. And again, as you can see here, almost 50%, 46.5% of the applicants identify themselves as candidates of color, which statewide, it's 20% of our teachers. So this is a kind of a really exciting number. This is also in the Leandro plan. It's also in all of the budgets that are being negotiated now. And last but definitely not least is this focus on principals. So in 2015, we passed a program called TP3, Transforming Principal Preparation, which has now been merged with the Principal Fellows Program. And it's based on a race to the top model of completely reimagining how we recruit and prepare and vet and develop principals, taking all of the financial burden and frankly, the time burden off of a teacher's shoulders who wants to become, and frankly, also recruiting in, because if any of us women understand about lean in, being able to pull people into the profession who are typically not represented is really important. And that's a big part of this initiative. And Suzanne, you mentioned kind of the importance of the supply of principal candidates. We've actually found that we have an adequate supply, but it's not lining up with exactly the need, right? If that makes sense. So what we're finding through this model is superintendents are saying, you know, I really need somebody who's going to be great at middle school, right? And so looking for candidates who have that kind of that special genetic makeup to be a middle school principal. This is really exciting. As of next summer, we will have graduated. The state of North Carolina will have invested into graduating over 450 principal candidates from this initiative already in just over 6 years, from the minute it was conceived to now, which is like lightning speed for this kind of work. And as Suzanne pointed out, we only have about 2,600 public schools, so 450 future principals is a good number. And this program graduates on average about 100 per year. So that's about 40% of the current state need. Again, this is a Leandro plan, and additional funding is currently sitting in the House budget and the governor's budget. So very quickly, but if you want to come to our website, we have a landing page on access and equity, which is also incredibly important. I'll point specifically to access to rigorous coursework, which is ensuring using testing. We know that tens of thousands of students are overlooked to be placed in honors coursework. And in 2018, North Carolina became the first state in the country that mandates if you score high on the math exam, you get placed in an honors course. And that summer, over 8,000 students got placed up into the course they should have been in all along, but they were deprived access. So there's some interesting stuff in here that's not really part of the Leandro conversation, but I just wanted to point to it. So that's a lot. I do want to point out just really quickly, I think the Leandro conversations, again, I'm an optimist. They're very important, but there are things that you can do today, particularly since it looks like a lot of you, if not all of you, live in Wake County as I do. Wake County does not offer advanced teaching roles. You do not need a law to make that happen. The advanced teaching roles is now a program recognized by the state, and the district can participate tomorrow if they want to. Second, prioritize school leadership, ensuring that the highest performing principals are in the highest need schools. There is a $30,000 a year bonus to move highly effective principals to low performing schools that Wake County has not tapped into. It's up to 3 years too. So it's a $90,000. Yeah, I wouldn't count all 90,000 of that, but that's a wonky kind of fact, is that there's a possibility that their base salary could come down, but not anywhere close to the 90,000. So it's up to a $90,000 bonus to move to a high need school. Funding flexibility, I can't underscore it enough, that the number one on the Leandro plan is about funding. The West Ed report mentions flexibility 51 times as a positive thing, but currently the plan does not offer the kind of flexibility that national and international studies say is important. Principals make really good resource decisions. You're never going to have a principal deprive your teachers of access to a janitor if it's going to cost $3,000 more, right? So I'll put that out there. Ensure that students are offered rigorous coursework. Wake County does participate in the math placement, but I haven't heard of any district that's really using that same approach for other tested subjects like English and science. So I would encourage that. And then incentivize high performing teachers and principals to work in high need schools, which I kind of already addressed. So those are some things that you might want to look into. And then I'll just, mostly just stop. I have some resources that I'll be happy to add in, but I want to add in that this is the Rogers diffusion of innovation theory. It's how people adopt to new ideas. So your friend who knew about the new iPhone before it was publicly launched, they're the innovators, right? And then your friend who stood in line for 2 days to get that iPhone is the early side of the early adopters, right? My BlackBerry had to die before I got an iPhone. I'm back there in the laggards. So some of these things like advanced teaching roles, not every county is going to opt in. It's a big cultural shift to move to this model. And I would say that we're on the front end of that curve. It doesn't take just passing the law. It takes having a really strong implementation strategy to move these things forward. We can only do so many things. We have about, if you can hold it on your hands, we're kind of focusing on that number of things at any given point in time, but it is really hard work, and I applaud anybody who's willing to kind of tackle it. Again, I'll put some of these in this is just a quick view of that landing page. Just below this section, you can find that 7-minute video. We also have a lot of data. Facts matter, go figure. But we have a whole book that if you want a physical copy, just let me know, but it's PDF'd on our page, as well as all sorts of data that's inside of it. To give you an example, here's what advanced teaching roles looks like. This is in our Facts and Figures book. This is what it would look like if you're a Charlotte teacher with 10 years of experience. You can make the whole range from $52,000 to $75,000, depending on your stackable pay. Here's another thing that I find interesting in the Facts and Figures, and it shows that our average spending is around $10,000 per student, but it's not every student. You take, my kids are probably student B, right? They didn't have a lot of special needs. They didn't even take the school bus in first grade. So they're at that $6,000 level. Other kids with higher needs, and our state funding is layered like this. I will encourage you to take a look when I talked about finance equity. This is per pupil funding by district for the state. It does vary widely, but it looks probably different than you expected. So if you look at these rural communities that are darker, they have more funding per pupil. Enough more, I am definitely not going to claim enough more, but I am going to point to that North Carolina is designed to provide more funding, and thanks a lot to the supplements that were done a couple of decades ago. We are at a place where this exists, and I think it's important to look at that. And then also to that equity point, if you look at these figures, our highest quartile poverty schools are funded at 31% higher than our lowest poverty schools. Again, enough more? Probably not, but we do have the kind of the DNA to get funding right in North Carolina. And then the very last, this is also there if you're curious about funding for every single school of the state by their demographic makeup, here you go. We have this on our website as well. And this is an example of economic disadvantage versus per pupil funding, but we have it by growth scores and achievement scores and all sorts of data. And again, just lots of heat maps and interesting stuff. So I'm sorry, I took a lot of time and I see there's a ton of chat. So maybe somebody can help if there are any specific questions.
Yeah, no problem at all. Oh, go ahead.
I see you asked about funneling into the school system from Teach NC. Mm-hmm. So Teach NC offers information about every single ed prep program in the state. It also has, for the first time ever in the state of North Carolina, a statewide jobs board. So teachers can actually look for jobs all over the entire state of North Carolina, which has been a real frustration point for teachers. We do not in any way hire or prepare or anything. All we're doing is kind of curating the information and being, providing those support systems to people to get into the system. That's where we found that the funnel loses people. So I'll give an example. There's this young woman who is just a hero of mine, who was an Uber driver who just recently graduated with a degree in forensics, and she was trying to figure out, someone had told her along the way that she had to go back for 4 more years to become a teacher. It's not right. So, she got into Teach NC and registered. She signed up with an advisor who's this incredible woman from Guilford County. And she said, my pain point is I'm not sure if I'm going to like it or be good at it. She said, well, why don't you apply? We have a TA position in our school. And she became a TA. A couple months in, she was like, sign me up. This is what I need to do. She went back for more support on what does she need to be able to get into a residency. Then she started applying to school districts, one district at a time, and she got stuck at that barrier because she didn't know where to start. And while she was in that process, our jobs board came up. She typed in middle school science teacher, which is, God love her. And within like 10 days, she had a job in Pitt County. So now we have a African-American female rural middle school science teacher, which is like, the holy grail for recruiting. And she's in her 2nd year already. So I'll just lift that up as an example of kind of the kinds of barriers that Teach NC helps somebody push through. And she admittedly would not have become a teacher. She just didn't have the right information and supports to get her there.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. I appreciate it. Why don't we come back? So I think there's some questions for both you and Suzanne. And thank you so much, both of you, for the wealth of information. And this is recorded, so you can come back to it, and we'll drop links in the chat as well. But Brandon, do you want to go ahead and let us know what some of the questions are that we have? And then Suzanne and Brenda, you can both address them or address them however it's best for you, if that's okay.
I do, just to kind of get a lay of the land. I know that Suzanne and your organization supports the Leandro Bill. Is that correct?
Yes,
Brenda,
absolutely.
What is Best NC's position on the Leandro Bill?
Leandro Bill or Leandro plan?
The plan,
so
yes, I'm sorry.
We support pieces of it. I would say that kind of like I described with the 1931 Machinery Act, it's imperfect, and I think it could be better. I'm just going to be candid within this group. Never been asked publicly yet, although I've asked to be asked publicly, so this is fine. But we, I have concerns, frankly, about the implementation strategy, about the funding flexibility, which I alluded to. But obviously the fact that every single one of our priorities is lifted up in the plan, I have no complaints about that. There are also other components about reimagining licensure that are just fantastic, and we're part of those conversations. I do have real concerns that, as I described with that innovation adoption, curve, having a really rigorous implementation strategy that's 20 years out, not 8 years out. That's probably my number 1-2 concern with the funding flexibility issue.
Okay.
So not unilateral support, but definitely support for
what pieces do you like most about it? And I guess you talked about pieces you don't like. What pieces do you like about the Leandro Bill, the Leandro plan?
well, all the ones that I just described.
Sure.
So yeah, anything that's really uplifting the profession. Obviously, also a lot of our members, we engage mostly on K-12 issues, but a lot of our members are really involved in the pre-K conversation and excited about that. So, I mean, yeah, I think a lot, the core of it is all very, very good. I think there's a lot of discussion to be had about the how, right? I think there's some lack of clarity around some of the how that's tied to some of the how much. But yeah, anything around, for example, we've advocated for the Teaching Fellows Program to be expanded to 1,000 graduates per year. That's hugely important. I would disagree with Suzanne's assessment that it's decimated. I think it's phenomenal. And for the 300 or no, gosh, we must be up to like, there must be like 500 people in that program. I think they'd be disappointed to hear that. But it's now focusing on STEM and special education, which is part of why it's smaller, because they haven't quite figured out how to market to that lane, which is unfortunate. But it also, your payback is halved if you work in a high poverty school. It's never didn't happen before. So there are components of that. But I'm 100% with the plan on expanding it, and our number is 1,000 graduates per year, which is a sizable chunk of what we need each year to fulfill vacancies.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I think my comment is related to the fact that it was eliminated and then only brought back to only cover special education and STEM. Yes, those are absolutely focuses, but we need it to be expanded as a whole program much, much more than it is. You know, we were exemplar in the nation for our Teaching Fellows program, and it just went away. And I want it back much more, much more than it was. And I would also say with the Leandro plan, I think my biggest beef with the Leandro plan is that it's asking us to get to the basement level. And I don't think that, you know, this is getting us into what is the sound basic education. And I don't believe that that's enough. And I think that we should be advocating for a world-class education for our children, because that's what our state needs. That's what our children need. That's what our world needs. And the moral obligation to just get to the basement level for me, is concerning, honestly. And yet at the same time, we know that the current bill, the current budget that we're waiting for, yet again, we're continuing to wait for from the legislature. You know, in 2018, they didn't pass a budget. They passed it, and then the governor vetoed it because it didn't have some of the things that it needed in it, and they weren't able to pass the veto, or override the veto. So we've been without a state budget now for 3 years. It was due in June. It hasn't been completed yet. It hasn't been fully passed. Each House and Senate passed it. The governor made his suggestions. They've been in conference for months now. We're still waiting on it. So we don't even know what's in it. And my biggest concern right now with Leandro is that they're going to piecemeal it and only make it a menu and make it, you know, where they pass pieces of it, when we know that it's going to take absolutely every piece of it to even get us to the basement level. So I think those are my biggest concerns right now, is what's going to come out of the budget bill, you know, that we're still waiting on now at the end of October from a June 30th deadline. So, you know, being the only state in the nation without a budget right now is pretty concerning, I think. And our teachers, you haven't gotten a raise in 3 years. They haven't. We're sitting on $8 billion of funding right now that the state has, because we didn't pass the budget in 2018. We have that money in the bank. This is not an issue of money for the funding for Leandro. It's not an issue of funding. You know, this is an issue of political will, and a legislature that just doesn't believe in public education and doesn't want to support the common good, and has no recourse because of the gerrymandering. So I think those are my biggest concerns. You know, we have to have the political will to make the basement level happen.
I have 2 questions. I'm going to try to combine them. Renee is talking about principal bonuses, principal pay. She says she seems to recall that compensation is tied to test scores, which are obviously historically lower in rural, poorer schools. Another, Sarah mentioned that her husband is an AIG teacher in Durham. sees big problems with some of the testing scores, Black, Latinx, poor students. Testing tends to be biased against these students. It doesn't reflect sort of their entire portfolio. And then again, it's what I'm reading here. I would be interested in hearing views on Leandro and revising student testing to reflect growth over proficiency. So two things with testing tied to pay, tied to student success, student ranking, all of these kind of things. Thoughts on these questions to both of you?
I'm happy to tackle, but Suzanne, you're welcome as well.
Brenda, go ahead. I don't have the data on the intricacies of that at this point. I can find out, but I don't know.
We have a landing page on principal pay. Agree completely that it shouldn't be solely based on testing. There is a component based on growth scores, which is definitely not correlated with rural versus urban. It's not correlated with poverty. It's not correlated with ethnicity. So that's a good thing. That was the decision, I will say, of the Principals Association in the conversations. We actually wanted a multiple measures approach. It is very difficult to find multiple measures that everyone was able to agree on. And we're working with a lot of folks, including principals groups, to expand that component to multiple measures of principal effectiveness, as well as multiple measures of school complexity. So right now it's just the size of the school, which it historically has always had the size of the school just measured in adults instead. Now it's measured as kids. But we think that, high schools are harder to lead than elementary schools of the same size. High AIG schools are harder. High immigrant schools are harder. Like so you can find that. I don't want to get super wonky on it, but there's room for improvement. The good news on the principal pay structure is there's already been a study, and it's only been in effect really for a couple of years now, and it took 3 years to phase in. The good news is there's already a study that's showing that highly effective principals are moving to higher needs schools. Super excited about that. We thought that would take several years to sort of happen, but it seems to be already happening sooner than we expected, even without the fine tuning that it requires. The other thing, it was a massive pay increase. It was, I think, a 25, 30% pay increase over 3 years. So like 80%, 70 something percent of the principals were below what is now the lowest point on the schedule at school with fewer than 200 kids in a low growth situation. So the floor of principal pay was raised up dramatically, which is, I think, very exciting. Testing, I talked about advanced coursework. Testing is imperfect. Testing one time a year, and I wouldn't call it high stakes, but I call it a high stress test, is absurd in this day and age. I took the GREs a long time ago. And I was able to walk in off the street and take it in an adaptive testing situation. It took an hour and a half, and I had my test scores immediately. Why in 2021 we're expecting kids to do bubble tests at the end of the school year and calling that adequate is completely beyond me. We are encouraging the movement toward competency-based learning, competency-based summative assessment, and competency-based formative assessment. So that we just want to know where the kids are. We can't do that advanced math coursework placement if we don't have the data. We can't meet every student where they are if we don't have the data, but the current testing is inadequate and inconsistent. And so I'm very hopeful. I think in all of the budgets that we're looking at, everyone has funding for some kind of competency-based shift. I think it's absurd that we don't have competency-based summative assessments, and really hope we move in that direction. So I thank you for those really thoughtful questions.
I'll say, as the organizer for North Carolina Families for School Testing Reform, what we were advocating for and what we continue to advocate for is formative assessments that are measuring, and giving teachers data that they can use right away. End of the year stuff isn't helpful for actual driving instruction, which is what we know we need. So, that's certainly not helpful. And I also am much more interested in the portfolio models of having students create, or the schools capture portfolio information for students, which we have the technology for today. It's just, we have a whole portfolio of the last 3 years of my kids' schooling, thanks to COVID and everything else. So, there's got to be a way that we can transform that into showing what they know, which is, we know is much better for especially our marginalized kids who,
Right.
who the bias of the testing isn't benefiting. So, you know, I'm hopeful that some of this will come out of the discussion as we consider, you know, how we can transform and think beyond. You know, I think COVID has hopefully pushed us to help think beyond the box a little bit more.
Anyone else in the group that maybe didn't put anything in the chat? Any questions or comments?
Well, I'll just say I'm a parent of one. Our oldest was a teacher for several years. She's not teaching right now, but our youngest is a senior in college in science, and he last month came to us and said he's changed his mind. He'd like to be a teacher. So a science teacher in high school, which is great, you know, but as a parent, you kind of go, oh gosh, not another one, you know, because we watched our daughter for 5 years just struggle in the system. I mean, she's a great teacher. She loved it, but it was North Carolina teaching kindergarten. So he's right now navigating, what does that look like? I think that one of his advisors mentioned Teach NC as an option. He's also looking at getting his master's, doing an accelerated master's to get a teaching license. This is kind of, you know, it's depressing to hear all of this, but it's also kind of encouraging to hear some of the efforts being put forth, especially I'd not really heard of Best NC, and kind of hoping that maybe our state in some way, I don't know how we move that forward short of kind of pushing, yeah, I guess pushing politically, like getting involved. I feel like that's the only option. It's funny because our son just texted me tonight. He's actually at a political meeting right now. I don't know why he's there. Like, this is our, you know, live free, it's college life, you know, loving college life. And all of a sudden he's concerned with these things. He has spent summers working with kids in STEM camps in low income areas, but teaching was not something we saw.
All of your kids are great teachers, though. I mean, they have great parents too. So I think Suzanne,
I would just encourage him. Sorry.
It's okay. I was going to say, I think we will talk in just a minute about how we can move forward too, and some action steps we can take. So hold on to that thought.
I kind of have somebody say, go ahead, Chris.
I was going to ask, I feel like Brenda was going to say something.
I would just encourage him, you know, not all districts are the same. I'm, you know, you hear all, you know, story. I mean, a bad principal will drive out great teachers, and a great principal will attract them even within the same district. So it's not just, and also districts like Charlotte offer advanced teaching roles with a lot of upward mobility and ability to really extend your reach without having to go to administration. So just look at the schools and the districts, and just don't paint it all with a broad brush. Even within like Wake County, we have a couple of restart schools. They're our highest performing Title I schools because the principal said, counselors are important to me. I'm going to fund them out of my flexibility. So, you know, I just encourage him to not, you know, get discouraged that there's going to be the right fit for him. Sorry.
Thanks.
Any other comments or questions? I have a comment, but I don't want to, you know, steal the spotlight. My only comment, I'm gonna go back and watch this recording. Both of you shared a map of North Carolina, and so in one map it was counties circled in red that were screaming for justice, and they're the ones, the original 5, right? That sort of said, look, this isn't fair. And on another map, couple of maps, we had like, these are our success counties, and these are our counties with have higher spending. And I'm curious, I'll go back and look, I'm curious if they align, right? So I've become more convinced that listening to the people who are crying out for justice, are they getting it now? And if the answer is no, then I'm happy that we're getting counties extra money. I'm happy that counties are having success stories, but there was a reason that counties started a cry for help. And I'm just curious to see, and again, I'll pull them side by side, but not really a question, but I think it's sometimes easy to forget the voices that were crying at the beginning of the story when other stories look good in the moment. That's kind of my comment on that.
I think you're absolutely right, Brandon, that it would be an interesting look. And I don't think the counties, that started the Leandro case 27 years ago, the progress has not been what it needs to be, for sure. It's definitely not, we're not there yet. And it's been 27 years. And how long, oh Lord, how long do we have to wait for justice, for our children? It's multiple generations of children now who have, been denied their constitutional right for a sound basic education. And, how many more generations have to go through it, through the schools too.
I think actually Leandro, who it's named after, was in 8th grade, right? When
he's a lawyer in Durham or Raleigh right now. He's in his 30s. Yeah. So, it's been going on too long. And so, I feel a real sense of urgency, with all of that. And the counties who need the most help still need the most help. They're, and the 5 that started the case aren't the only ones who needed help then either. And it's been going on for a long time before the case started. So it's not just 27 years. It's, it was not good when, that's why they started the case. So it's just too long. Our kids deserve better.
Yeah,
and I can answer.
Go ahead, Brenda.
I can just answer the question, which is the Leandro districts generally have more funding. Again, enough more is the question. And I think it's a really important question to be asking. And then if you talk about the other maps, all of the Leandro districts are participating in the principal model. And actually the principal model that we're talking about started in Edgecombe County, in Vance County, and in the Sandhills. So that whole kind of stretch of North Carolina, that's what was the inspiration for the TP3 model. So, but again, somebody who graduated in 2018 is not yet a principal, or might maybe 20% are principals by 3 years later. So it does take a lot of time, kind of again to the innovation adoption curve. Advanced teaching roles is in Vance County, Halifax County, Edgecombe County, Pitt County. But Hope has applied to do it. I think they're developing their own model, and probably the only, and Cumberland has I think just started doing it. So yes, the Leandro districts are overlaid on that map, but they're just starting, right? So there's hope, but this is not to say that the problem is in any way solved. That's why they're sitting in the Leandro plan for expansion. It's going to require funding and frankly some policy shifts to go to full implementation of either of those 2 examples. And
a good start would be to distribute some of that funding that we have waiting. I mean, that would be a really great
And also the Leandro districts, when I talked about inflexibility, they're losing millions of dollars right here, right now, because their teachers are less experienced and therefore they're cheaper. Millions of dollars. And it's specifically, if you look at the overlay of the map on that one, it is absolutely the Leandro districts, including Charlotte. So it's not just an urban rural thing, but Charlotte was one of the next to join into the Leandro lawsuit, and they lose money every single year because they're not funded at the average, they're funded at for their pipeline, which is deprived access currently in those Leandro districts. It doesn't mean that other districts wouldn't be the losers at some other point in time. So fixing that formula should benefit all and provide stability for everybody.
Okay, thank you both. We're going to end here because I want to value everybody's time. I'm going to give you all both the opportunity to share how we can get involved, but we always end Theology Uncorked with a question: what does this mean for people of faith? This is a Theology Uncorked. So as people who have faith and are people of faith, what does this mean for us? How do we get involved? What are next steps? We've obviously, both of you have presented depressing facts and statistics, but I think with kind of what Chris said, advocacy and being involved and knowing what next steps are, it's time to get things moving and transformed. And hopefully my grandchildren will benefit from some of those things. And Chris's son maybe will be able to participate as a teacher. So Suzanne, I know you had some some stuff that you wanted to let us know about,
Yeah.
and then we'll close out a little bit more.
Absolutely. We have a new initiative. Our first big initiative is Pastors for North Carolina Children. We're, trying to mobilize congregations as what really an untapped resource in education advocacy. And so that's the role we're trying to fill, especially within the Every Child in Sea coalition, is bringing the faith communities into the conversation. And the way we're going to be doing that is through a program called Mission Amplify. And it is a letter writing campaign that we're launching in January. And we're in the process of inviting congregations and participants into the program. We'll be doing some training in January, and it is inviting congregations or community groups or your local Bible study group or your neighborhood wine and book group. I mean, we're open to whoever would like to participate, civic groups, anything. To join us once a month in writing to legislators about a specific topic. And we're asking as a minimum that each group would write 10 letters a month. So that's 5 people, 2 quick letters, or 10 people writing 1 letter. They'll be sent to either your legislators yourself, if your legislators, as we'll research and help you with that, whether they're supportive of the Leandro plan or if they are not. If they are supportive, then we'll be writing to those who are not as supportive. And if your legislators are not supportive, then you'll be writing your own, as constituents. So we're hoping to basically flood the legislature with letters each month, continuing to remind them in the prophetic tradition, in the tradition of Amos and Micah and the prophets to speak truth to power in a very non-threatening way, a way for congregation members to just dip their toes into advocacy. Eventually we'd like to do visits to the legislature, have an advocacy day. We had our first prayer vigil last Monday. So be doing some more of those types of things, but we know a lot of people find that really intimidating. And so we want to make it really easy and start with postcards and letters, that are not even having to talk to somebody leave a message on the phone, which can be intimidating. So we want to be able to train advocates up to speak for students, for schools, for the children, and also, to share those stories, to share the narrative of what really is happening in our schools and in our communities, and why this is important, why this is, as people of faith, that we, care about our neighbors and care about the children among us. So if you all are interested in participating or getting involved, I can get you more information about that. I have little packets that we've put together that I can bring by to the church. These are our little postcard party in a bag packets. Each month we'll provide one topic for information. So we're starting out with nurses and the need for having 1 nurse in every school and meeting the ratio of 1 nurse for every 750 students. We think that's the bare minimum that we should be having, and that's not being met in the state in most places. So we'll start there. We're sticking with the really non-controversial topics. So nurses, schools, psychologists, counselors, psychologists, social workers, the helping people who, are really important in the schools because they help the teachers be able to teach. If the teachers are having to be the social worker as well, they're not able to focus on the art of teaching and the work that they have to do to help our children. And we need those extra bodies in the building to really be able to provide the support for the children that's necessary. So we'll be starting there and then looking at different aspects of the Leandro plan to help educate people about the program, and then also to encourage our legislators to be supportive.
Great, thank you. Brenda, do you have anything that you wanted to add?
I had my long list, and I would just sort of double down on that. All politics are local, and there's just so much opportunity within our community. And I would say that kudos to Suzanne. I think that's a great strategy, and starting with things that we can all agree on is a great starting point. I think in Wake County, my concern as a parent whose kids attended our local Title I elementary school, when you look at the report cards for that school, it's the vast majority of teachers have fewer than 3 years of experience, and you go 5 miles down the road to an affluent school and it's the majority have more than 10. And those are tough choices that your school district has to make. And so, having a voice within your school district of why is that happening? Why do our most needed kids have less access to experienced teachers? And we know there's an inflection point for teachers around the 7th year where they're higher performing. And so I would just really kind of stress there's a lot that can be done here and now while also working on these longer term strategies.
Great. Thank you both. All right, I'm going to end our recording now, and then